if I change the organization of the tension compression, then the body knows how to resume its normal strength and its normal flexibility and its normal coordination. I'm adapting to my system and what it can do at the time versus overriding it and just, thinking I need to do the 30 reps because that's part of my HIIT workout.
Thank you everyone so much here at Emily Stewart Fitness Extra page on Facebook. One of the people that has most affected the way I think about the body and movement, and especially pain, is Kelly Clancy. She's here with us today. She also happens to be my aunt. And I can't believe how lucky I am to be a fitness instructor and have someone who knows so much about movement in my family. So it's an honor to welcome you here, Kelly. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thanks, Emily. It's so great to be with you. I feel really honored and humbled that I get to spend time with you.
Let's just start with you telling a little bit. I find it fascinating about how you came to the studies that you're currently in, really back from the beginning when you were working with hands.
Well, I'm actually an occupational therapist by background, so I've been practicing in the field for about 34 years. I have always had an interest in kind of human development and understanding the body and the mind. So much of my career was around rehabilitation. So I've worked in a lot of rehabilitation facilities, helping people recover after injury. And I started to really get more and more interested in the patients that I was struggling with, that I couldn't help, and that weren't getting better with a traditional allopathic model. So I ended up going off in a lot of different directions, trying to find solutions to what I was seeing in front of me clinically. And where it led me is this beautiful exploration of what it means to be a human being. And it's taken me to places that have really surprised me. And one of the areas that I really started to focus most on is chronic pain and how and why we end up having chronic pain, much of our population, unfortunately, and how our psyches are morphed into what we're experiencing in our physical body. So I currently teach other movement manual therapists, physicians, OTs, PTs around how can we approach working with people in a way that is working with their whole systems, the body, the mind, the psyche, the mental, the spiritual, the emotional, and how can we bring in some dialoguing processes while we're working on the physical body? How can we use light touch techniques to be able to facilitate a shift in the global system? And then what happens when we integrate that with movement? So yeah, it's really, really fun. I'm a constant learner, and I love being a student of all of this.
Yeah, and you definitely are, because whenever I spend time with you, I always find you're asking me questions that I feel like you genuinely want to know. And every time you ask me a question, I give an answer. You always kind of I can see you thinking about it and considering how that affects the me that you already know, which is something I really try to bring in now to my personal sessions with my students as well. So there was kind of three big things that I took away from in the fresh tissue cadaver dissection that I did with you. Most of you here on Emily Stewart Fitness remember when I went away to Boulder to cut open a body, and I was so excited about it. Well, this is Kelly. This is who brought me there. One of the things that you've come to teach others about is the idea of tensegrity. Can you explain a little bit about what tensegrity means within the body? And I think that gets to what you mean by the interconnectedness of it all.
Well, most of us went to school and we learned our anatomy as isolated segments. So you would learn about what the bicep does, where it's attached, what innervates it, what is its action, and what bones it moves. But when I got out into clinical practice and I started to work with people with movement and manual therapy, what I really could see is how other injuries in their system are impacting and influencing local areas that I'm trying to treat, that maybe where the pain is. So the training that we all traditionally go through is what's called a biomechanical model, right? And the biomechanical model is very much based on man as machine, right? And so if man is a machine, then we just take out a part and put another one in, or we replace that whatever that needs to be replaced, and then everything should function right. But that's not how biologic systems actually work. We work more from what is now called a biotensegral model. So that term biotensegrity was coined by Dr. Stephen Levin. And he took the concepts of Buckminster Fuller and Kenneth Snelson that were looking at different forms through architecture and nature, that our forms are actually held together and are mobilized by forces of tension and compression. And that tension compression relationship is what keeps our bones spaced apart, what keeps our structures under tone, and allows us to be able to have the elasticity in our system as well as the stability when needed. And so an example would be like this is a tensegrity structure. So you can see how it's held together. It was held together until this one broke, but it's held together by these forces
my
of
rib
compression.
right now.
Exactly. And so the bones aren't made to touch, right? And if this gets tight enough, then you pop your rib out, right?
Yeah.
Because there's too much tension in the system. So if you really believe this principle is the organizing principle in our biologic systems, and you let the biomechanical model go, then the treatment interventions will be based on the tension compression and where there's abnormal tension, where there's excessive tension. And it becomes really, really interesting to see how the global system is really interconnected.
Yeah. So this is one of the big things too, that you really turned on for me, and that I use all the time in thinking about my own body as well as my students, because like anyone who moves people or touches people, I constantly have students come to me and say, this hurts, and I ask for it. I constantly ask my students, is there anything that hurts today that you want to focus on? I always get something, but it's sometimes you have these, I get these students who have a just persistent chronic pain that's not necessarily a pain that they've experienced through their whole life, but it's something new and yet acute enough to keep them out of class. Mm-hmm. And one thing I always say to them, which I'm struggling to do more here because of the language issue with German, but I think I'm getting there, is a word that something I've heard you say and others, the victim is not the criminal. Mm-hmm. So can you explain a little bit how just because something hurts, and I've already done that, but just a little bit more concisely or thoughtfully, I don't know, just because something hurts doesn't mean that's the origin of the pain, or that itself is its own reason for pain. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's really can be simple and complex in that, if you look at this tensegrity structure and you're coming in with low back pain that's found here, often it can be the tension patterns that are above and below that are creating excessive elongation or excessive pull in this area. So the nerve fibers get irritated, the muscular fibers start to get inflamed, but it's because of this criminal over here that's creating the excessive tension in this area. Wow. So having something similar to this can be really helpful when you're describing it to clients about why you're not specifically working here. But having said that, I would say that I also recognize that there's a psychological aspect of having somebody touch your pain, or somebody to listen to your experience around that pain. So I often spend a lot of time in my treatment working on the criminal, but I always make sure I maybe start and end with touching that victim, because that relational aspect of my communication with your hurt place, it in and of itself is healing.
Yeah, totally. I mean, when I have a shoulder ache, I just want Kendall to give me a shoulder rub. And 5-10 minutes later, it's probably still aching. But in that moment, the alleviation of even the mental worry about it goes so far. So to kind of put that in perspective, so I figured out that you were awesome when I was living in Seattle and I started following some of your work. Then I just dissected a fresh tissue cadaver with you, which was so cool. I can't even explain to you all the stuff I learned there, but I will never, ever look at my work or the body the same way. It's just, this is such an appreciation for the way we're put together. Then I had an injury, if we want to call it that, during coronavirus, right? And many of you students will also remember, right when COVID hit, I got like a deep groin injury, deep in my pelvis. I really struggled to do lateral lunges. I really struggled to put weight on that leg. And I called you first, Kelly, because I was like, I don't know who to go to. First of all, it's going to be hard to massage this spot. Even Kendall, it's a little bit awkward. Second of all, I had gone for a long run. That was all. It was something I did a lot at the time. And when I called you, the first thing you said to me was, you need to listen to it. And for anyone who's in pain, that's always a little bit difficult to hear. I also didn't understand really what you meant, even though I had been following you for a while. And you told me that, and then we had a session, and then I started working with other people as well to help me get some physical therapy into it. And it went away quite quickly. And that was when I first realized the emotional tie to pain through my own experience. You kind of put a scientific hat onto it that wasn't woo-woo. Listening to the pain is not woo-woo, but it is a totally different way of treating pain. So tell me a little bit about what that means and how others can start to do that for themselves.
Yeah. Well, again, it's like this it can be so complex if you really want to get into the areas of the brain that are stimulated with the pain receptors in the body and how they're closely interrelated to memories and past experiences and our way of processing information. So there's that whole scientific thing that makes it non-woo-woo. What is culturally really different than what we traditionally operate under is that we're used to getting rid of pain, having a war on pain, putting things on it, cutting it out, whatever needs to happen. And what I invite people to do is actually to move into their pain more. And so that can bring up a lot of anxiety and fear for people. And that's why the relationship of your therapist is so important to really be present with you, because having somebody with you while you do that is really helpful. But what often we can find is that by moving towards the pain, going into the sensations more, staying in the present moment, asking the pain, why, what's happening? What are you noticing? What's here? Finding out more characteristics about it. It's really fascinating, Emily. Often it'll start to talk back and it'll start to say things to you, and it'll start to reveal itself that maybe there's an unresolved issue that maybe is wanting your attention, or it's letting you know that there's too much overwhelm and the system is having to start to go into a fight or flight response or a freeze response or a shutdown response. So I really believe that our symptoms are actually our friends. And the more that we can befriend them and get to know them and try not to get rid of them, that we can start to learn a lot about ourselves and really evolve in the way that I think our real purpose is in our functioning. Why are we here? What are we really living into our integrity, our values, being who we're supposed to be in the world? And believe it or not, I believe that our symptoms and our sensations can actually be the roadmap to help us understand that.
Yeah, Yeah, that's a really interesting idea. You know, a lot of the time, especially in the fitness world, you know, a lot of instructors say, you know, you have to go into the pain to learn how to get through pain. You know, and there is the idea of no pain, no gain, which I completely disagree with. But I do often have my students discuss with me the fact that learning how to deal with the shaking legs in bar helped them learn how to deal with the shaking heart before a big presentation. And I do, now that you kind of frame it this way about listening to the pain, I do actually see how dealing with things in like a loving and thoughtful and compassionate way can make us stronger people and better at dealing with more things than something, you know, very obvious and in our face, I guess.
Yeah, it makes me think about psychologists talk about the window of tolerance and having resiliency in your system. And if there's too much tension, if there's too many spots in our systems that are having to retract, over time, the capacity for the whole system to expand becomes diminished. And so we can easily get overwhelmed with very simple things that are happening, versus if we learn how to move into our pain and our sensations more, it's almost like we're building a bank. You know, we're putting dollars into our bank, so then when the big things come up, our systems can expand a bit. So it makes me think about, this is another toy that I love to play with. It's called a Hoberman sphere.
Okay.
And you know, really our bodies don't stretch. So this is another very controversial biotensegral kind of concept. Yeah, exactly. So, you know, if you believe this, if you're going to drink the Kool-Aid, Emily, you're going to have to change the language. But
oh my gosh.
I know. So we don't stretch our hamstrings. We don't stretch our, you know, whatever. Instead, our system does two things. Our system only does two things. It retracts and it expands. So if that's all we do through our, you know, fluid systems, through our cells, through our breath, through our structure, then if I have a lot of rigidity or pain, my system's going to retract around it, right? So if I try to get rid of it, it's going to retract more. Our nervous system is made to do that. It's there to protect. But if I learn how to not have to protect all the time and I can expand out, then when the next hard thing comes up in my life, I actually can do this. We're made to do this. We're not made to be expansive all the time, and we're not made to be retracted all the time. So it's kind of a cool way of reframing.
That's so interesting. And that makes the breath work, and not just yoga, but so many, you know, every fitness basically has its own breath work. Well, not every, some of them should. CrossFit should have some breath work.
Exactly.
But that makes sense then, the idea of, you know, inhaling and creating space, so to speak. Right. Again, another term that I think is overused and now deemed as woo-woo, but when you put it that way, it actually just makes sense.
Well, and again, if you think about, actually, we have multiple diaphragms in our body. So we have a diaphragm in our cranial bones, in the bulx and tentorum. We have diaphragm here. Yeah. We have our respiratory diaphragm. We have our pelvic diaphragm, and then we have our diaphragms that go down into the arches of the feet.
Yes.
So they're all supposed to be organized in a pressure gradient that allows this to happen. So if my respiratory diaphragm has a lot of in and out, it's helping the motility of my organs, and it's helping the organization of my pelvic floor. My pelvic floor, with its own organization, is helping my respiratory diaphragm, right? And that all relates all the way up and down our system. So it makes sense that the more resiliency I have in my emotional system, my physical system, my thought patterns, the more resiliency I have for all of it.
Yeah, that it all goes. That's so another interesting thing. So I kind of want to talk about, you know, two pain points. So right now you've seen me in two pain points. You've seen me with my seemingly emotionally triggered hip issue. And right now, my non-emotional, I guess, triggered rib issue. But as you and I will continue to discuss, it's all related. I've been having another problem here with actually my voice. And most of my students here, you will have noticed in the past 3 or 4 weeks, my voice has been progressively scratchier and scratchier. You would think I smoked a pack of cigarettes a day. I don't smoke cigarettes, but that's how bad it's gotten. And I saw my other movement therapist, Kevin Moore, who will hopefully be joining us eventually as well. And he really was thinking that it was because the diaphragm in my stomach and the diaphragm in my throat were not working together. And so he's been working a lot with me to just connect with the diaphragm at the back of my throat and start to use it in conjunction with the diaphragm at the bottom of my rib cage. But how that all came up was not because I went to him with the scratchy throat, it's because I went to him with some mid-back pain that was really bothering me 3 or 4 months ago, which I equated to working in this hotel that I was at for a while. And he was like, it's so interesting that you sound like this right now as well. And once we got my breath a little bit more free, once we started practicing breathing into the back of my rib cage and just working with the belly diaphragm and then connecting it to the throat, the back pain completely disappeared. And now my voice is starting to return. So that's so interesting to me, how once you kind of know how these systems go together, because was one of my next questions is, okay, we're drinking the Kool-Aid. We see that the victim is not the criminal, and we see that all these systems are connected, but, and I see that I can listen to this pain and it's going to tell me something, but how do I get past it? That's always the question we want to know. How do I find the criminal? How do I actually find the criminal? And, I don't know. Do you have any answer to that? For me, I still don't really understand, but I'm starting to understand how I can find the roots, so to speak.
I would say that there's 2 magic bullets that everybody can do on their own. Okay, you ready? The first magic bullet is curiosity. How can I look at my system in a way that's non-judgmental, that's not critical, that doesn't believe that there's something wrong with me, it's non-pathologizing, but instead can just have pure curiosity. So that's the first bullet. The second one is compassion. So self-compassion. It's one of the things that I found over my career is always a factor with people that I'm working with, that we all as human beings live in a society that our own internal self-compassion is de-emphasized and often reinforced to do the opposite. So if I can go into, like, I think about my system as an ecosystem. So my physical body and my emotional and my thought patterns and my spiritual connection, it's all just an ecosystem. And if I can go into that ecosystem just a visitor, a tourist, and just with a lot of curiosity and a lot of love for what I'm seeing. And when I run into a barrier where I'm not seeing that, I'm seeing more resistance, more judgy, more critical, then I can stop there and start to have more compassion about that too. Like, why are you here? Why did you develop? How long have you been here? What is your intention for the system? So when I hear you talk about your voice, it makes me think about, yes, respiratory diaphragm, but that's still too reductionistic. We need to look at the bigger. We need to look at the pelvic floor's relationship with the respiratory diaphragm, with the voice. We need to look at your feet and how, your experiences of being on this earth and being planted on the earth versus not being planted on the earth are affecting your stability in your world. And, you move a lot. How is Austria really helping you feel centered?
Yeah.
And or not centered? And how is that affecting your physicality? So, it's almost like when you ask me questions, Emily, it almost makes me have 10 more questions that I can't give you answers. I can only give you more questions.
No, these are answers. And they're definitely not answers that we hear often on YouTube in our fitness classes, our HIIT classes. You know what I mean?
That's right.
And then we have plantar fasciitis and we can't do it anymore and we're just angry and it's great. So I think one thing that we have to make sure we discuss is because it's part of the whole biotensegrity model, and it's also very hip, maybe less hip than it was 2 or 3 years ago. But fascia, talk to us a little bit about fascia and how it plays an integral role in this mind body environment micro macro system.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it is funny. We have like decades of things. So I think that the last decade was all about fascia and fascia research, and everybody in the movement and manual world got onto that. And now we're starting to trend into the nervous system. So you're probably hearing a lot of things about nervous system and regulation and polyvagal theory and all of that. So, but again, all of those things are reductionistic. We can't look at them in isolation. But I can talk about fascia, but just know that it's so relational. As I was talking about earlier about this isolated anatomy that we learned, it's not so much about the muscles, it's about the wrappings that are happening both in a macro and a micro. So we have connective tissue that Emily got to see in our dissection course that wraps around muscles, but then there's fascia that wraps around the muscle fibers. There's even wrappings that go even deeper into the fibrils themselves. And so all of this is part of a tensegrity structure. So if I have, let's say, a scar in my abdominal area due to a C-section, that will naturally, because the connective tissue, the fascia, was altered, it'll change the tension patterns throughout my fascial network. So we have some fascial networks that force transmission happens through. We can call them myokinetic chains. So things like Tom Meyer's work, or other people who've talked about these connections. That's a way that force gets generated. But they're all connected to each other, and they're all relational and creating our kind of synergistic capacity to have movement occur. Yeah. So I think about, when I treat people, I don't think about the muscles so much. I think more about the wrappings that the muscles are in and where those wrappings are connected to other places.
Right. So, and this was something recently, I did have a student who was struggling with some pain on the bottom of the foot. And I went back actually to the online course that I'm taking with you about Thomas Meyer's fascial anatomy book. And, I just asked her, like, are you getting a lot of headaches as well, right in the front of your head? Because I knew that we had this fascial train, that myokinetic train, if you want to look at it that way, from the tip of the toes up the back of the body to the front of the head. And she was like, yeah, actually I have been getting a lot. And I was like, okay, well, before you work out, just give yourself a little head rub and see if it helps. And it has been helping, as well as other more physical therapy, traditional model things. But that's, to me, I think, if there's a takeaway for the average mover on fascia, just even being kind of aware of the fact that we do have lines of connection, power movement, like you say. And if something somewhere down there hurts, just to think about, well, if I give something else along there a little bit of a rub or a little bit of a love, could it release some tension? And that's so major, because in so many ways it goes against traditional physical therapy.
That's right. Right. Yeah, and it also makes me think about the fitness industry, how we've really gotten into doing a lot on our fascia, right? So it's the interest in fascia has created another industry, and it's created an industry of tools, right? So you've got your vibrational theraguns, you've got your scrapers, you've got your rollers, you've got your balls, and my opinion about all of that is that the harder the surface that you're using in your tool, the less effective you're going to be. So if I'm going to use a ball, I use a really soft ball. If I'm going to use a foam roller, I use a really soft foam roller. If I'm going to use any kind of tool, I'm making sure that it's actually pretty light, and I'm usually not treating the site of pain, but I'm treating the surrounding areas that could be tight, that could feed into that area to give it some more room.
That is such a good point. And I have, mentioned that to my students a few times. So what you're saying here is, if you have pain, it's great to acknowledge it, as you even said, what you do with your clients. You start there with something nice, treat the rest, end there with something nice, just to let it know it's been talked to. You don't dig into it, you don't grind into it, and that's not usually the focal point. So I have a question. This might be a bit of a reach, but a lot of people come to me. This isn't true. My students are amazing, so don't let me say this. But I see other people out in the world who say, I want a bigger butt. I want bigger biceps. And so I'm just kind of wondering, I know about hypertrophy and creating larger muscles, increasing muscle mass, but I also have come to understand that it's pretty hard to spot, treat, tone any one part of the body. Is that also and somehow related to tensegrity and the fact that it's all interconnected and you can't just go into one spot and fix it?
Well, yeah, it's an interesting idea because the body's super adaptable, and that's the beauty of our work. Because even people who've had injuries way long ago, people will say, well, that's just how it is, or I've inherited this. All of the men in my family have this thing. And what I would say is, yes, we're born with a certain amount of, genetic code, but we also can vary that due to, we understand epigenetics and we understand fitness training, that you can create more bulk if you load things consistently over time, but you would have to maintain that level of load and probably have to increase it to actually keep that. So the question that I always come back to is, how would that serve you, and who is it serving in your system? Is there a part of you that feels inadequate, that you feel like you need to have bigger biceps? Well, sure, we can do that, but I'm also curious about, is that going to be satisfied? And if so, what will that get you? So I always come back to the, why are we doing this? And how is it serving you, in a really non-judgmental way? If that's what works for you, then I'm happy to help you. But I also want you to know that there are a lot of other, ways you can be in the world, and just kind of getting to the root cause or the root reason about why we have our belief systems in the first place.
Yeah. So this gets me to another aha moment that I had while dissecting that cadaver with you. We opened up the stomach and we saw adipose tissue. Am I saying that right? Adipose tissue.
Adipose.
Adipose. Yeah. We saw the sheet of adipose tissue covering this relatively thin person's body. And we had a long discussion that day about the role of fat. And since that time, I've actually done a lot more study, not necessarily on the role of fat, but both on the role of muscle and fat in the body, and the different hormones that they trigger, and how they both are incredibly important to the function of the system. Muscles, not just as movers, but as hormonal regulators. So that day you expressed that fat is, to a certain extent, incredibly important, and it has a way of moving. That was news to me. Can you share a little bit about that with my students?
Well, the superficial, we have different layers or depths of tissue. And so the superficial skin layer, right underneath the skin layer, we have an adipose tissue layer, and it's connected to our superficial fascia. So if we do anything to try to, force that adipose tissue to shift through a tool or something like that, we actually, because it's hormone receptive, or involved with the hormones and involved with energy, storage, then you're going to start to dysregulate other systems in the body because of that. So we also have a layer that you might be referring to that's more of the deeper fascial and the fat layers. And as we age, that fat layer can start to become more of an indicator of disease processes, or not as healthy as one would be. So my belief system around adipose tissue is, again, that whole compassion piece, and also understanding that nutrition, inflammation, all of those things are going to strongly influence it. And the more we can keep our fat layers healthy and accept them as part of our system, just like I would accept my hand as part of my system, then again, getting back to the whole compassion piece, that there's no reason to vilify a part of our body because our society has told us it's good or bad.
Yeah. And you also really, I think, in that moment, highlighted the effectiveness of fat as protection. Right. And you kind of mentioned, I had remembered that this particular person had what seemed like a pretty hunched over arrangement or pattern. He had a bit of a hunchback. And, when we saw it, it was covered in fat on the top. We were all like, whoa. And you're like, well, that's protecting it. His bones are exposed right now. And all of that muscle had become fascia, right? Like it was quite sinewy. And I saw in that moment, you're like, this is what fat does. It helps. Mm-hmm. And so if you have an injury, and this happens all the time, at least that I see, my students get an injury, and then they notice that section of their body is, has a little bit more tissue around it. Mm-hmm. And I always think that's really pretty cool. I mean, we don't want that there forever per se, just like we don't want to be injured, but how amazing is it that your body just moved that there to help out?
Yeah. Yeah, and we see it around neurovascular structures. So where nerves and arteries and veins come together, like in our axillary tissue or in our groin tissue, the body actually has a little fat pocket that protects that as it goes through these vulnerable places that aren't otherwise protected by a bone or something. So yeah, it's consistent through the whole system that you see that.
Oh, that's so cool. It's so cool. So let me ask you this, and I want to get to this for sure, because I tell this story a lot, especially in my more small group sessions, about Aunt Stacy. So shout out, Aunt Stacy is in this group. I got all my aunties in my group. This is such a great career for me. So we were at a family reunion. I led a yoga class. Aunt Stacy, after the class, was chatting with you and I about the fact she can do tree pose on one side and not on the other. For my non-yogis in the group, that's the balance pose with one leg out to the side, standing on one leg, super zen. And you said, I don't even remember what you said. You asked her a question and you kind of thought, oh, I think you must have a block there or some sort of restriction. You laid her on the ground, you relaxed her a little bit, you helped her move her knees in a few different ways, the one knee, you did some testing, you called it, and then you gave barely anything. If an onlooker was looking, it would look like you were barely doing anything, just with your thumbs kind of moving around her hip joint region. You had her get up and walk in a circle backward, and then you said, do tree pose. And she did it. And this was like magic. This was like, it made me at first feel like, oh my gosh, my job is for nothing. Here I am trying to get people to flex their butt cheeks so they can do tree pose. And in fact, I just need to lay them down and wiggle their knee a little bit. But it was amazing. Can you explain to the average person what just happened right there? And is there a way for us to know if we just need to see you so we can do tree pose?
Well, I mean, it's like the tensegrity structure again, that, if I have weak abdominals, let's say this is my abdomen, and my trainer keeps asking me to get these to engage, but if my hip flexors or my low back are super, 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 super tight, the connections, the nerve endings to this region are going to be altered because the nerve endings in this tissue are actually embedded in the fascia. And so they're the connectors to my brain trying to get me to contract, and they're under too much tension. So that's one thing. The other thing is if I'm trying to get this to contract and be organized, if there's too much pull elsewhere, the force vectors won't allow there to be the stabilization around the pelvis, right? So that whole leg is twisted. That's what I could see with Stacy because I was doing yoga behind her. And I could see she had a rotation in her leg. So every time she tried to bear weight on it, there was no way that she could actually get the force vectors of the head of the femur bone to go in the acetabulum. So she was, really struggling. So all I needed to do, and this is a biotensegral concept, if I change the organization of the tension compression, then the body knows how to resume its normal strength and its normal flexibility and its normal coordination. So I don't need to strengthen anything here. I actually need to just change the environment so the force vectors are optimal.
Amazing. So that leads me into another thing. One of the coolest things about Thomas Meyer's book is that he shows a lot of yoga poses. And I know that you exercise, you run, you go to group fitness classes focused on strength and cardio combinations. I know you do yoga. I know you do gyrotonics. I'm saying that right?
Gyrotonics, yeah.
Gyrotonics. Yeah. So for us people who love movement, and I know in most of my students, they tend to have, one kind of movement they really love. Some students really love yoga. Some students really love running. As a mover, now that we understand this biotensegrity model of the body, would you say there's one style of fitness that's best? Would you say there's something that we definitely can't miss out on?
I think the more we know our bodies, the more we'll know what's best for our bodies. So for me, my tissue runs tighter. I'm not super flexible. So as a marathon runner, most of my life, I started to recognize that this is now crossed the edge where it was helpful, harmful. And so I needed to shift my activity because I was listening to my body and my body was telling me that it was no longer serving me. And so now in my 50s, I spend more time doing, long walks, more gentle stretches. So I'm adapting to my system and what it can do at the time versus overriding it and just, thinking I need to do the 30 reps because that's part of my HIIT workout. Yeah. So it's a hard thing as a trainer because I think what you can do is you can say, I'm inviting you that you can have this opportunity to do this thing. But the most important thing is I want you to listen and notice when do I actually need to shorten my arc of motion? When do I need to actually lower that weight on certain days versus other days I could bring it back up again? Because our bodies are continually fluctuating. It's not like I can do the same thing every single day and think I'm going to be safe.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And, for me, what I try to do, and one of the reasons I've done so many different types of fitness certificates is I really try to give my students all of the options. And I really try to encourage them to try different things, try yoga, keep your body guessing, keep muscles working in ways that they wouldn't always work. Yep. Because especially from learning from you, I see that thing all the time in my head. It's on Kelly's website, by the way, www.kellyclancy.com. Is it a .com?
Yeah.
Yes. And that's your header image. And I just feel that if we can let our body explore all the different ways, create the sensation of power, create the sensation of space, we're going to be pretty good. And in my recent injury where, I slid on my side into the tree, it was really pretty funny. I can't do it, but I wish we had gotten it on video. I think I probably would have gotten more hurt if I didn't do so many different styles of fitness so frequently. Definitely, I don't recommend people do as much fitness as I do, but that's my job, and if I had more rest, maybe I wouldn't be in so much pain. But let's just loop back to that kind of, I think, as our final question. A lot of people will get hurt like I did, just accidentally. I literally just slipped on some ice, snowboarding. This happens when we do sports. But there's a certain something that's happened here. As she and I discussed before our meeting, that she thinks I popped a rib out, not pushing it even, going light, but working it in class this morning. I'm pretty sure that this has not healed the way the other side is healed. A, because I fell on that side, okay. But B, because there's something emotional being expressed here. Do you think that there's ever such a thing as pain for pain's sake, or as an accident that won't have any psychological, repercussions, or just reflection?
Mm-hmm. Well, I just want to circle back that the reason that I love your work so much, Emily, and I support it so much, is that the variation. So I do want to highlight variation. I think that's really, really, really important. The more choices our system have, the better longevity-wise we're going to be able to function. So, and I would say, get used to continuing to do activities that challenge you. I think that's really great. As far as the psychological with acute injuries versus more chronic conditions, is I think that there's a benefit to examining the psychological no matter what. Yeah. So, it's not like this woo-woo, like you caused yourself to hit a tree kind of thing, but it's like, what are you noticing comes up for you now that you're in this situation where there's more restriction in your pattern? So how are you responding to this? What are you noticing comes up around your sensing this, And so I would imagine there's some fear, there's some anxiety, there's concern about, oh my God, am I going to be able to get better? What does this mean for my career, right? Like, so that's what I would be interested in your situation.
Yeah.
And right. And, what are the lessons? Is there a way that I can use this situation to really benefit me, to learn more about myself, that I could actually just slightly adapt myself, just like we would do with an exercise, so I can learn how to be more expansive as this heals. And it might mean that, you might need to shift some of your behavior patterns or your belief systems to help you be more adaptable.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. So knowing what you know about movement, knowing what you know about the body and its, physiopsychology, do you have any, I guess you've already said one thing is to try to introduce as much variety into exercise as possible, but do you have any advice for people when it comes to their fitness journey, if we want to use that kind of overworked term right now? But do you have any advice for anyone who's just moving in general?
Yeah, I think move. This is again why I love what you do, because you make it accessible for people. But every day it's about like maintaining the ability to squat, maintaining the ability to get up off the floor, maintaining all of the different variations of sitting that you can be in. So, if you're sitting in front of a Zoom screen all day, then when you're not in a meeting, you should be spending time doing a lot of varieties of motions to keep your system adaptable.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I could sit with you for hours, but I think we've probably given people enough to think about right now. So thank you so much. Kelly can be found at www.kellyclancy.com. You've been published recently in a book about Bowen therapy, or you helped write it?
I just wrote a chapter in a book around fascia, on a technique that I do called Bowen therapy. Yeah.
Probably be seeing more of her coming up. Hopefully I'll see you in Europe and maybe take the weekend off and meet up with you somewhere. So thanks, you so
Emily.
Much.
Yeah, bye for now.
Thanks so much for watching this episode. If you watched it the whole way through, give it a like, and be sure to comment below with who you'd like to see next on Emily Stewart Fitness.